In the spring of the year 1003, a pope died in Rome, and a small group of clerks entered his private room to make an inventory. They expected chalices, letters, vestments, rings, and books. What they found, according to the later file, was harder to name. A counting board marked with strange figures. A star table copied in a hand that did not look Roman. A brass object shaped almost like a head. And a packet of notes from the Spanish frontier, where Christian monasteries stood close enough to Islamic libraries for knowledge to pass quietly across the border. The dead pope was Sylvester II. Before Rome knew him by that name, he was Gerbert of Aurillac, a monk, a teacher, a mathematician, and one of the most unusual minds of the 10th century. Centuries later, stories followed him. Some said he had learned forbidden arts in Spain. Some said he owned a speaking head that answered questions. Some said no Christian cleric could have known what Gerbert knew unless he had crossed a line that the church did not want named. This episode is about the file later readers nicknamed the Muslim Pope. Not because the record proves a conversion. The record does something stranger. It shows how a pope became suspicious because his knowledge came from the wrong direction. Welcome to Terra Chrono. If you like archive stories where one object changes the meaning of an entire life, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The official story begins far from Rome, in Aurillac, in southern France. Gerbert entered monastic life young. He learned grammar, music, arithmetic, and the ordinary tools of a Christian education. But ordinary tools were not enough for him. In the 960s, Count Borel of Barcelona took Gerbert south into Catalonia. This detail matters. Catalonia was not Cordoba, and Gerbert was not suddenly living as a scholar inside the caliph's palace. But the frontier was porous. Books moved. Instruments moved. Numbers moved. Christian monasteries near the Spanish March could hold manuscripts that had passed through Arabic-speaking intellectual worlds. For a young monk trained in the colder schools of Northern Europe, this was not just a change of place. It was a change of scale. The sky could be measured. Calculation could be accelerated. Geometry could be taught with instruments. A table of stars could turn prayer hours, royal schedules, and political timing into something less dependent on guesswork. To us, this sounds like education. To some medieval readers, it sounded like contamination. The first object in the Lateran packet was a board. The description is short. A flat surface divided into lines, with small counters and signs placed near the margins. A simple clerk might have called it a game. A trained teacher would have recognized a calculating board. Gerbert was later associated with the reintroduction and teaching of advanced abacus methods in Western Europe. The point was not that he invented arithmetic. The point was that he made calculation visible, portable, and fast. That can sound harmless until we put it back into its century. In a world where authority often moved at the speed of messengers, where land, tax, inheritance, calendar, and astronomy all depended on people who could count correctly, speed was power. A monk who could calculate faster than a court could argue looked less like a scholar and more like an instrument of rule. The second object was a star table. The archive description says the parchment was folded twice, stained at the edge, and copied with several marginal marks the Roman clerks did not understand. No one needed the marks to be readable for the rumour to begin. The image was enough: a pope's room, a foreign-looking table, a dead man famous for knowing the sky. Gerbert's real letters show a mind hungry for books and instruments. He was not hiding from knowledge, he was chasing it. He asked for texts, he discussed astronomy, he taught logic and mathematics. He moved through the intellectual networks of Rheims, Ravenna, Rome, and the imperial court. But later memory did not preserve him only as a teacher. It made him into a warning. The third object created the strongest legend: a brass head. Later stories claimed Gerbert had made a head of metal that could answer yes or no. Some versions made it demonic. Some made it prophetic. Some made it the reason he rose so high. The file does not need a demon for the object to matter. Imagine a bronze instrument on a table, hollow, polished by handling, connected in memory to astronomy, timing, or demonstration. A teaching device becomes a machine. A machine becomes an oracle. An oracle becomes proof that the Pope had gone too far. This is how archive stories mutate. The most frightening version survives because it is easier to remember than the most accurate one. By the time Sylvester's reputation passed into hostile pamphlets and later chronicles, the pattern was already fixed. Gerbert knew mathematics. Mathematics came through Spain. Spain meant Islam. Therefore, the knowledge had to be suspect. That is the logic of the accusation. Not evidence exactly, more like fear arranged into a biography. The clean version says Gerbert was simply the smartest churchman of his age. That is true, but incomplete, because his intelligence was not neutral, it was useful to kings and emperors. Otto III saw in Gerbert a man who could help imagine a restored Christian empire. Gerbert became teacher, advisor, archbishop, and finally pope. He took the name Sylvester II. The name itself mattered. The first Sylvester was linked in memory to Constantine, the emperor who made Christianity imperial. A new Sylvester beside a new emperor suggested a new Christian order. But beneath that grand symbolism sat the same uncomfortable problem. What if the mind helping design Christian renewal had been shaped by knowledge preserved and developed in Islamic lands? The fourth object in the packet was not an instrument. It was a list. Several books, some identified by subject, some by physical description, some only by opening words. One line was later damaged. A copy made in the margin translates it only as the Spanish Book of the Heavens. This is where the episode turns, because the rumor that Sylvester was Muslim was never really about private belief. It was about ownership. Who owned the stars once they were calculated in Arabic? Who owned numbers once they had crossed a border? Who owned knowledge after a Christian monk copied it, taught it, and carried it all the way to Rome? A crude accusation solved that problem. If Gerbert's knowledge was demonic, the church did not have to admit it was useful. If the brass head was magic, no one had to ask what kind of instrument it had been. If the Pope was secretly corrupted by Spain, no one had to say the more dangerous sentence: Rome needed what came through the Islamic world. The fifth object was a note. It appears only in the later inventory copy, not in the earliest list. That makes it dangerous as evidence, but perfect as a clue. The note was said to be found tucked into a coverboard. It contained 4 words in Latin: not conversion. Method. We cannot treat that as a confirmed historical artifact. But as an archive trace, it explains the whole case. The accusation was looking in the wrong place. The question was not whether Gerbert had secretly changed religion. The question was whether a Christian institution could absorb a rival civilization's tools while pretending the tools had no origin. In public memory, Sylvester became the Pope with a demon. In the archive, he looks more like the Pope, with a transmission problem. His instruments travelled faster than the story that could explain them. His methods arrived before Europe had a comfortable language for their source. His reputation became the place where admiration and anxiety fought each other for centuries. That is why the Muslim Pope file survived. Not because it proves a hidden Muslim on the throne of St. Peter, because it preserves the fear that, for a brief moment around the year 1000, the highest Christian office in Europe may have been occupied by a man whose most powerful tools came from books his enemies were supposed to fear. At the end of the inventory, the clerk does not write a conclusion. He writes a location. The board was placed with the teaching books. The star table was placed with the calendars. The brass head was placed with the instruments. No demons, no confession, no trial. Just objects returned to shelves, waiting for later readers to misunderstand them. And maybe that was the real secret. Not that Rome had crowned a Muslim pope, but that Rome had crowned a man who knew where the light had come from. If this archive file left you with one question, like the video, subscribe to Terra Chrono and turn on notifications, because the next mystery begins the same way this one did, with an object no one wanted to label correctly.